As we're dealing with all these things going on, we'll get to what we're going to talk about. But remember, everything we're dealing with and some of the different types of traits that we as Christians need to have. Just think on that for just a moment. As Daryl was talking about a little bit ago, he said today's Father's Day. And when we talk about today being Father's Day, it's a day for fathers to be recognized, and it's a great thing. But when I really think about it, what it really is a day to recognize that there are those who are trying to teach their children. And when we talk about that, their children are learning from them, aren't they? Each and every day, your children watch you. And your children learn from you. Hopefully not that to learn how to drop things. But your children learn from you. This isn't really something new to anybody. When we talk about learning from others, we know that we're going to learn from others. We call them role models, don't we? We look and we see these people and we say, I want to be like them. The world won't deny that they have role models, that they want to have role models. And they look and they say, see these people who are always in the public eye. These people like athletes, if it's NBA, NFL, MLB, whatever it might be, they're people who say they're role models. I want to ask a quick question. Is anybody in this room not a role model? No, absolutely not. Everybody in this room is a role model, because even though the world might look and say, well, there's these people in the public eye like athletes, or maybe our leaders like our president or our senators or congressmen and congresswomen, all of these people. But really, when we look at it, everybody is. Because our family is probably our greatest role models. There are those who are going to have more influence on us than probably anybody else. I know I can say that because even if my little boys were here, they're still role models to each other. As I watch Jackson learning and doing things, who is he learning them from? Logan. A lot of times it's learning how to get into trouble. But he is indeed learning from him. Learning how to do these things like climbing up on shelves that they're not supposed to be. Learning how to do all these types of things. They are role models. And I think about myself, because sometimes being a role model it's not just to the bad. My brother, if he was standing up here next to me, a lot of people would say, you can't tell us apart. And for a little while, that actually got switched because he shaved his head. And then he started growing a beard. What I realized is I actually like looking like my brother. I enjoy it. And he tells me all the time, he says, you did it just because I did. And you know what? To a little bit, that's true. I still look up to my big brother. I still look up to the man he is. And still say, man, I want to be like him. We are role models, each and every one of us. And it's something we need to come to the realization of. But when we talk about role models, what we need to realize is that you seek counsel in them. Maybe you don't go up and you say, hey, what do I do with this? Maybe you don't call LeBron James and say, hey, LeBron, what do I do with this? But you know what? When people look at them, they're going to look and they're going to say, well, how would they handle this? How would they handle these situations? In 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 8. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 8, here we have the story of Rehoboam. Remember, Rehoboam, the people who came to him and they asked him, they said, please lift this heavy yoke that your father has put on us. So what does Rehoboam do? He goes to the elders and he asks them for their advice. The advice of the elders is this, is that they said, well, lift that yoke, because then the people will listen to you. Rehoboam doesn't really like that answer. And then he goes here in verse 8, it says, but he rejected the advice which the elders had given him and consulted the young men who he had grown up with, who stood before him. Verse 9, and he said to them, what advice do you give? How should we answer the people? Have you spoken to me, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on us? The young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, your father made your yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. When we look and we see Rehoboam heeded the advice of his friends. When we look at our role models, we actually are going to be heeding their advice. Something that is often used is that WWJD, right? What would Jesus do? But how often when we look and we see people today, they're going to be thinking, what would such and such do? Realizing it or not, they're seeking their advice. They're seeking their counsel. Because they're trying to follow in their steps, do what they would do. And when we look at role models, this is really where we're going to get into our lesson more. When we look at role models, we realize they all have different traits, don't they? They have all these different traits of its courage, meekness, financial sense, compassion, honesty, loyalty, kind, loving, self-control, whatever it might be. What we see is that these role models have different traits. This morning, I want us to talk about one trait that I think is tested in our life more today than it's been. And that's patience. We need to realize that this trait holds extreme value. In Ecclesiastes, the 7th chapter and verse 8, it says, "The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit." We heard the saying, patience is a virtue. Patience indeed is. That's what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about patience because when we look for our role models, this is one of the traits that they might have. Maybe this is something we need to look for in our role models. But first, we're going to look at patience, and when we talk about that, we're going to look at patience like God's. As man, it's hard for us to even fathom the type of patience that God has. Because His patience is so great, is so grand. But we're going to look at it and we're going to recognize right off the bat that His patience is not in vain. It's not an empty type of patience where He doesn't know what He's doing, where He doesn't know what He has. Over in 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, and verse 9. In 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, and verse 9, says, "The Lord is not slack concerning His promises, some count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, that is patient toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." God's patience is in that He does not want us to perish. What is God's patience built on? God's patience is built on love. God's patience comes from love. That's a great lesson for us when we look at this patience and we look at the patience that we're supposed to have, the patience that we need to have. It doesn't just come and say, well, you're just a person who's able to be patient. No. Patience is something that we gain from the love which we are able to have. Over in John, the 3rd chapter, and verse 16, it says, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life." That right there is telling us and speaking to the same point of 2 Peter chapter 3. We're talking about the fact that God's love and His patience is so great towards us that He doesn't want us to die. So much so that He sent His own Son to die for us. 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, and verse 4. Here we look at what love is. It says love suffers long. That is, love is patient and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. It is not puffed up. It goes on and lists of what love is. Love is having patience. I'll be the first to admit right now, my patience is not where it needs to be. Not by a long shot. But you know what? I'm so happy that I had this time to be able to realize I need to work on it. I need to work on this because it's only going to make me have more love in my life. It's only going to make me strive to be more like my Savior. Turn over to 1 John, the 4th chapter, and verse 7. See, when I say it's going to strive to make me become more like Christ, it's because Christ had love. Christ, just like God, is love. In 1 John, the 4th chapter, and verse 7, it says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love." Patience is something grand for us to be able to have, but it comes from this love. But we see this patience with God when He is with Abraham. We're going to be using Abraham quite a lot this morning. Turn over to Genesis, the 18th chapter. In Genesis, the 18th chapter, here we have Abraham, and he goes to God in verse 23. And he asks God, because God is going to go and destroy Sodom. And he says in verse 23, and Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Now this is showing that compassion of God. But as we continue on and we look in the remaining verse in verses 26 through 33, it says, so the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. There's God's love for the righteous. Verse 27, then Abraham answered and said, indeed now I who am but dust and ashes have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were 5 less than 50 righteous, would you destroy all the city for a lack of 5? He said, if I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And we see this list goes on, but it drops every time, doesn't it? Starts at 50, and then it goes to 45, and God says He will not destroy it for 45. He will not destroy it for 30. He will not destroy it for 20. He will not destroy it for 10. You know, when you look at it, we really see God's patience here. God's patience in showing that He wants to do what's good for the righteous. He wants to help the righteous. But you know, when we look at patience, and patience kind of goes along with all these things that people look at today and say, well, that's kind of weak. You're not willing to stand up and do something right away? That's really weak. Well, no. When we look at God's patience, it's not saying that God's weak. Actually, when I look at patience and I see the patience that God has for us, what I see is strength. And I see it as strength because when we look in places like Nahum, chapter 1, verses 1 through 6, and we see what God is capable of doing. And we see this all throughout the Bible. But here specifically in Nahum, verses 1 through 6, it says, the burden against Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum, the Elkoshite, God is jealous and the Lord avenges. The Lord avenges and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on His adversary, and He reserves wrath for His enemy. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. Even though we're talking about this wrath of God, what is it still comes in here? It talks about His patience still. In verse 3. The Lord is slow to anger. Slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. The Lord has His way in the whirlwind, in the storm, and in the clouds, or the dust of His feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry, and dries up all the rivers. Bashan, the Carmel wither, and the flower of Lebanon wilts. The mountains quake before Him. The hills melt, and the earth heaves at His presence. Yes, the world and all who dwell in it. Who can stand before His indignation? Who can endure the fierceness of His anger? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by Him. Patience is a weakness? No. No, patience is a strength, and it shows a strength in love. I apologize for that. Let's turn over to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 11. We'll read just a part of this. It says, for if God did not spare the angels who are sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. And it goes on. When we look at what God did, what God is able to do, and yet what did He do? He waited for Noah to build this ark. He waited to be able to save him because he was a righteous man. No, God's not weak in His patience. God is strong in His patience. But when we look at this patience and we talk about it for us, what we need to realize is that there is labor in patience. Patience is something that we need to work at, that we have to work at. And it's really hard for us sometimes. It's really hard, especially in our society. How often do we say, you know what, I want this. I'm going to run down to the grocery store and I'm going to pick it up. We don't wait for it. We just go get it. I want this new car. I want it now. Okay, I'm going to go get me a loan. I want this new gun. Okay, I'm going to go put it on a credit card. Whatever the case might be. That's what we do. A lot of people today, they have incredible amounts of debt because they don't wait. They don't have patience. You know what? Our society is really that way. But there is labor in that which is good. There is labor when you look at the things which we need to have that are good things to have. Over in Matthew, the 20th chapter, verses 1 through 16, here we find the parable of the workers, the laborers in the vineyard. We talked about these two parables the past couple weeks in our Sunday evening Bible class. And when we looked at these two parables, what we saw is that in order to do the will of God, it required work. In order for the workers or the laborers to end up getting their day's wage, they had to do the work. In order for the Son to do the will of the Father, he had to do the work. In order for us to have patience, we need to be willing to put in the work for it. We need to be willing to put that in. And that's why I'm talking about it right now, because we need to have that time now. We have that time now to put this work in. We're dealing with all these things going on in our life, all these things where we don't really know what's going to happen next, what new law our government's going to come up with. And what we need to realize is we need to make sure we have patience. We have endurance. They go together. They're not the same thing, but they go together. We need to make sure that we have this patience. Those who are parents who have spent a lot of time with their kids lately, and they didn't realize how much they lacked in patience. This guy, I did not know how much I lacked in patience. Because I find myself very quickly looking at Brittany right now and saying, I need some help. I don't have patience today. I look over, I can't deal with the simplest of things sometimes. I realize I lack here. But you know what we can do when we recognize this is we can say, cool, now I can work on having more. Now I can work on being better with my patience towards my children, my grandchildren. Maybe then I can work and become better when I'm dealing with those in the world. But patience takes this work. It takes this type of labor. If we look at Abraham and Sarah's patience, it's really interesting me looking at some of these older characters. Because we looked at Job and we saw that he had this preparedness. But what his preparedness was in God. When we look at Abraham, when we look at Sarah, and we see their patience, Abram initially had some pretty great patience with God. Pretty great patience in waiting on what God said was going to happen over in Genesis, the 12th chapter, in verses 6 through 7. There God tells Abram as he is in Canaan. He tells him that this land will be the land of your descendants. But did Abram get it right then? Did he get to have this land right then when God said that this is going to be the land of your descendants? No. No, he had to wait. It had to wait a little while through famine, through travel. Turn over to Genesis, the 13th chapter. Verse 12 says, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities on the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Remember, this was after they had gone, and Abram and Lot had recognized that they couldn't share this land, right? So what do? They separate, and now, that is when Abram dwells in this land. It didn't just happen overnight. It didn't just go out and get a loan and buy the land. No, that's not how it worked. He had to wait to have this inheritance, to have this given to him from God. He had to wait to have the son of promise, because Abraham is promised in Genesis, the 15th chapter. Verses 4 and 5, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This one shall be your heir, this one shall not be your heir. But one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Excuse me. And then he brought him outside and said, Look now toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to them, So shall your descendants be. You know, you look at this and you really think, man, Abraham, he has a lot of patience. Well, let's keep looking a little bit. Because we look and we say, he does have this great patience. His patience comes from the faith in which he has in God. This patience comes from the faith that he has when God tells him something's going to happen, that will happen. But what do we see in Genesis, the 16th chapter? In Genesis, the 16th chapter, let's begin in verse 1. It says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had bore him no children. And she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, See, now the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go unto my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. What do we see here? Their patience kind of wavered. Sarai says, you know what? The Lord hasn't let me have children. Let's go ahead and help out this plan and give you an heir. Let's go ahead and do this because well, we can't wait any longer. We're going to be past the age of having children. But that's really not what we see in God's plan, is it? See that they needed to have that patience. They needed to be able to wait. Genesis, the 18th chapter. Genesis 18, verse 11 says, Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore she laughed within herself, saying, After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? Both of them are old. Both of them are really past the age of being able to have children. Sarah specifically mentioned saying that she is past the age. Sarah specifically being past the age and being barren all of her life, not able to have children. Does anybody think that's not going to take patience? No, it's going to take patience. It's going to test her patience. And we see that her patience wavered. But you know what? When we look at patience and we see that it wavers, sometimes it's going to help. We'll look at that in just a moment. We'll look at how that actually might help one with patience here in just a bit. Because when we look at different role models, we need to make sure that we're picking the right role model. We need to make sure that we're picking the right person to be our model for patience. Turn over to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 4. You know, we all know exactly where I'm going right now, don't we? When we talk about having the right role model, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, it says, Therefore I urge you, imitate me. This is Paul speaking to the church at Corinth. If you skip down in your Bibles and you go down to chapter 11, verse 1, staying in the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul says again to the church at Corinth, he says, Imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. Paul doesn't say imitate me because I'm righteous. No, he says imitate me because I'm imitating Christ. He says put your role model in Christ. We see the same thought that we are to walk as Christ did if we turn over to 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, verse 6, He who says he abides in him, let me restart. He who says he abides in him ought also himself also to walk just as he walked. We're talking about Christ. Walk at Christ's walk. Use him as our role model. Those bracelets that said WWJD, they actually kind of helped a little bit because it made you think, what would Jesus do? When I'm going to seek counsel, who is it going to be in? Man or God? Well, it should be in God. When we look at Jesus as this example of patience, man, he is the ultimate example of patience. He is the ultimate example of this. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 20 through 21. There it says, For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? Saying, what credit is it if you're being beaten, if you're going to take this patiently? What credit is there? Continuing on. But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. Doing good and suffering, but we take it with this patience. This patience like Christ did. Turn verse 21. For to this you are called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Look at how Christ suffered. Look at what he suffered for us, and look at how he took it. Patiently. Not all these big, huge shows, even that we see today. No, Christ took it silent, as a sheep led before slaughter. No, he really is the greatest example of patience that we have. And when we look at his patience, where did it come from? Think back a few slides. From love. Just as when we are parents, our discipline comes from love, so does our patience. Mike said, this was a while back, everything comes from love. In the Christian life, everything can go and trace back to love. But you know what? Sometimes in our life, maybe we're not actually looking biblically for example. Maybe we falter and we start looking for examples in the world today. I know we do this. I still look to my brother and say, I want to be like him. I still look to my dad and my brother-in-laws and these people. I still say, I want to be like them. Because I see how they're able to provide for their families and the good things that they have. But if we're looking for somebody who, in our mind, we say they have this perfect patience, I've never seen their patience wavered. Let me ask 2 questions. Has their patience been tested? Do we know if their patience has been tested? Let me ask this other question. Do they know the value of patience? Do they know how valuable this thing is that they need to have? Because I hope when we're looking for one with patience, because we're going to do that. We're going to look for these role models on earth today. But if we are, let's look for the one who knows the value of it. And you know how the best way to really know the value of it is when you've wavered. When you wavered in it and you realize, man, I should have had more patience then. Then you start learning. That's the value. If I'd had more patience, what would have happened in that circumstance? Probably something a lot better than what it did. That's what we need to be looking for. Those who know the value of these things. Jesus surely knew the value of patience. And we should always look to him before anybody else. But when we don't, because we're human, what are we looking for? We read Ecclesiastes 7 verse 8. We know that there is value here, but in Hebrews the 11th chapter, in verses 8 through 10, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. We're going to face things in our life today. We're going to face these hard times today. Is our patience, our faith growing in God? I hope that it is. I hope our faith is ever growing in God. Our patience is ever growing. Because when it does, we will be better. There's no getting around it.